did studies on our twins looking at their gut microbiome and 100 different diseases. And in nearly all of them, people who had most disease had more abnormal gut microbes.
Maybe you have some bloating, maybe you have diarrhea, constipation, irritable bowel. It can also lead to psychological disturbances, mood disturbances, energy, lack of energy, and other chronic diseases, metabolic disease, which then is the root cause of heart disease and even neurodegenerative disease in the futures.
Unlike genetics, however bad your gut microbiome is, everyone can improve their gut microbiome just a few days. And what we're seeing with people who do improve their gut microbiome is dramatic improvements in things they didn't expect.
Dr. Spector, thank you so much for joining me today on Extend. You came quite a long way, and I really appreciate you being here.
It's a great pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. I hear that you sometimes do your podcast right across the street from where we are here in West Hollywood. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, just a few months ago, we were doing a whole series of podcasts, the Zoe podcast. Yeah, so
I love it.
It's always nice to be on the other end of the mic as well.
It is, right? I always say it. You and I were talking about this a minute ago, that this podcasting thing is probably the best thing I do. I love having these conversations with incredibly intelligent individuals like yourself and Dr. and Professor Spector, right? Tell me a little bit about the professorship. Where do you teach?
I'm Professor of Genetic Epidemiology.
Okay.
Which most people don't know what that means, but
right.
it's sort of looking at genetics in populations at King's College in London. And so that was based on my work there, which for 30 years was building up this big twins cohort.
Right.
So I was originally a rheumatologist.
Yes.
And was a practicing rheumatologist. Then I decided I was much more interested in research, and then switched and set up in 1993 this massive twins cohort.
Yeah, famous cohort. Yep.
Yeah, which is, unique in the world. That's been following 16,000 twins for 30 years now. Looking at nature v. nurture, and that got me really into looking at all kinds of different diseases.
Sure.
So not just the arthritis as a rheumatologist, I had the same model, and whatever was common, I could look at it. And it just really opened my mind to all aspects, so holistic aspects of medicine. But obviously with twins, I was focused really on the genetics.
Sure.
And really doing that for 20 years, discovering genes, for obesity, for, all kinds of things. But then latterly got a bit disillusioned because I couldn't see how the genetics was going to change treatments or change people's lives. And it was rather a sort of pessimistic message to tell people, what are you going to do? Blame your parents for everything? It's like, well, you can't change your genes to any dramatic extent. You can tweak them a bit, and I've played around with epigenetics a little bit. I realized that still we were talking about tiny little increments rather than the big changes I want to do. So that partly, and a few other things led me to change really into this whole area of gut health, which is where I am now. And I got there via the microbiome.
Right. Your twin study is absolutely fascinating because, like you said, following along on some of the papers that you've published, it did seem like a little bit of a over enthusiasm about genetics and how much we could control these genes. Initially, that's what we were thinking when the DNA first got sequenced, and it was going to be the holy grail of all of medicine, and it turned out not to be.
Yeah, and as always in medicine, the story's always more complicated.
Exactly.
People think, aha, it's simple, right? There's an obesity gene. All we got to do is knock that out, and then there'll be no more obesity. There's a rheumatoid arthritis gene. There's a colitis gene. There's a depression gene. And it turned out that there weren't. There were, 10,000 of these genes or tiny gene variants all having minute effects. So the ability to just cut them out of the equation or have a drug that interfered with them really wasn't on. And so it took us a while to realize that, because as the technology improved, we got more and more finer detail.
Right.
And as you got more and finer detail, it kept finding more and more genes.
Right.
We thought it was really simple when we started because we couldn't really see, we saw these segments of the whole chromosome. We thought, and people were selling whole segments of chromosomes to drug companies. Columbia would buy, the leptin gene segment or something and think they would. So it was all kind of crazy stuff. So it turns out that genetics has been amazing for rare diseases.
Absolutely, right.
Game changer for people with these rare single gene mutations, and you can have therapies for it. But for the everyday disease of aging, really it's a very limited use, other than often telling us some of the mechanisms that are going on, that the genes will point to a protein and they'll say, okay, this is clearly involved. And 10 years down the line, you might then, a drug company might work on that pathway, which could then lead to some help in that disease.
Right.
But it really wasn't the big game changer in the way we expected.
Absolutely.
It takes a lot longer to develop anything that's going to change it. So that's why all the big medical breakthroughs have often been by chance, by studying something else, like, the GLP-1 drugs or whatever, rather than us saying, oh, we knew that, GLP-1 was one of the key obesity genes.
Right.
It didn't work out that way. It was in the list, but it wasn't, didn't stand out.
One. Right, absolutely.
So, but it, I think it was a very necessary step. And without the genetics, we wouldn't have had the techniques and the tools to look at the gut microbiome.
Sure, exactly.
So I don't regret any of it. And in a way, you've got to go down these scientific journeys, full of optimism.
Right, exactly.
Because otherwise, if you wouldn't be a scientist if you weren't an optimist.
You have to be an optimist, yes.
And you realize, at a certain point, you've got to say, okay, I've given that a go. I need to change track. And, a lot of my colleagues never change track.
Right.
And you must have known this, your days at Mayo.
Yeah.
Where these people that just stay on the same pathway and they just hope before they die, it's going to come to something.
Right.
But, people like myself will, every few years will change and say, no, that's not going anywhere. what's the most exciting thing I can follow?
Right.
So that's been my modus operandi, if you like, is to, chase up whatever the latest new thing was, thinking this was going to be the big thing. So that's why, back in 2000, I think it was about 2009, 2010, I discovered the microbiome.
Right.
But no one else was talking about it. And said, this could be something big.
Mm-hmm.
And unlike some of my other decisions, that was the right one.
Yeah.
And so, you got to hedge your bets a bit. But if one of your choices is a good one, then, as a scientist, that's pretty cool. So I don't regret that decision. And, it's still one of the most exciting areas of science today. And still,
absolutely.
We're only scraping the surface of what we know about it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fun, but it was genetics that got me in there.
Yeah.
Because you use genes to determine what these microbes are.
Right.
Otherwise, we'd still be growing them on Petri dishes and looking at their colors and, trying to work out what they were in old-fashioned ways. So, it's really fun. And it's now opening up us to discover not just bacteria, but also all the fungi that are living inside us, the viruses and all kinds of stuff. So,
amazing.
It keeps me excited.
Yeah, it's extremely exciting. And like you said, for the listeners that are listening to this, the science took a massive leap forward with the microbiome when you can use the techniques that we use to sequence the human genome, to sequence the genome of the bugs that live in our gut. And prior, the only way we knew was to grow them on Petri dishes and look at them under a microscope. And you could also not really quantify. It's extremely confusing because you have a lot of different
and you could only grow about 1% of them.
Right, exactly.
And we were only obsessed with the ones that were killing humans, so the infectious ones. And so we had this very distorted view of microbes. We just thought they're out there to kill us.
Yeah.
We've got to eradicate them.
Right.
We've got to sterilize everything. We've got to throw antibiotics at everything. We've got to nuke them, because we had this selective view that, we were only taught about in medical school, the nasty ones.
Yeah. And so, I did my first half of my career studying as a surgeon, and we would always do what's called a bowel prep before we did any surgery in the intestinal area, because if a bacteria were to get out into the abdominal cavity outside of the bowel, it would kill somebody. It would make them septic. And so I always wonder, why does our body allow these bacteria to live in our gut? I mean, it just seems so counterproductive that nature would have evolved against something like this. But then the realization came to me when people on high doses of antibiotics were actually dying from C. diff. And when Clostridium difficile, to your point, was grown in some of these patients' petri dishes, when you sent their samples to the lab, you knew that this was a big problem. This person would likely die from sepsis from C. diff. And so during my career, they actually figured out that C. diff was an opportunistic bacteria, an opportunistic meaning that when the good bacteria are eradicated, then the bad bacteria would grow. And that was the first inkling I had that there were good and bad bacteria that live in our gut.
Yeah, and even now, most people don't think there's a downside to antibiotics.
Right, yeah.
They go to their physician and they say, I've got something, and the physician will say, well, it's probably a virus. I say, well, I don't care. Even if there's a 1 in 100 chance it's a bacteria, give me the pills.
Right.
They're going to cure me. And we have this strange, love affair with antibiotics that are really, nuking our good bugs every time we take them.
Exactly.
And most people recover from them. Some people can take 6 months. There are lots of studies now, and there's some people who never recover. And, a lot of the problems that we face in life, we may look back in time and say, well, when I was a kid, why did my parents give me so many antibiotics?
Right.
Why every time I had a viral problem was I given this? And I think the average American 18-year-old has had about 20 courses of antibiotics.
Absolutely, yeah.
By the time they're going to college.
Right.
And the average 3-year-old has had, 3 or 4 courses.
Oh, absolutely.
And you think, this is no way to treat your body's defense system by, knock it on the head all the time. And we need to change this, quite dramatically and stop using these non-specific antibiotics that just, blitz everything.
Right.
Why don't we, go for these more targeted types of treatment, or, not use them, because often the difference is maybe half a day of sickness. Most of these chronic respiratory problems or sinusitis, or I used to take tons of antibiotics. I used to get recurrent sinusitis. Yeah, particularly as a student, it was, but the studies have come out and said, if you take them or you don't take them, it makes at most about a day extra symptoms.
Right.
Trivial.
But
if by taking it, then you're getting more and more infections every time your immune system isn't working as well. And then if your immune system's not working as well, that's also got implications for, your response to aging, your mental faculties, your ability to fight cancers, all these things we never reckoned with until we understood how important your gut microbes are. So if I had my life again, I think, I'd be making really different decisions.
Absolutely. I think many people would say that, especially on antibiotics, growing up in the eras that you and I grew up, where, like you said, antibiotics were a panacea for everything. They would get premature infants antibiotics as soon as they were born, even though they had zero infection. They would just give it to them prophylactically. There's this whole concept that we've learned through the years about prophylactic antibiotics. And I can tell you in my career as a surgeon, again, we would give everyone prophylactic antibiotics. And
you wouldn't even ask. I mean, that's the other thing. It was like so routine. It was given with the anesthetic often, wasn't it? So, every childbirth, every C-section, so most people didn't realize they were getting all these antibiotics as well, because it was like routine care.
Yes.
And all the surgeon cared about was making sure there was no infection in their operation, right?
Exactly.
And that's how we judge a good surgeon, is you say, well, yeah,
they don't have infections.
The least infections, because otherwise it's his fault, right? Or her fault. Not thinking, well, yeah, but if that, 6 months later, that patient's going to be in trouble again, was that related to giving them these unnecessary antibiotics?
Yeah.
Or later in life. Yeah. So it's, it's stacked up against the poor old microbes. They have a tough time. Anyone going to hospital, it's really hard to persuade surgeons not to use them. And you can understand why, because that's the way they're assessed in a way. They don't get any benefit from taking that tiny increased risk, do they? I mean, it's just, so somehow we need to change that dialogue to make people accept, the fact that there is this tiny increased risk of infection, but we're going to keep their immune system and their microbiome much healthier if we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of surgeons now were giving prophylactic antibiotics after surgery too. So you put people on a 7 to 10 day course of antibiotics, whether they needed it or not, to prevent an infection. And that is pretty much stopped now for what we call clean cases, where you're not going into the gut. But still, it's still a massive overuse of antibiotics in the medical community, as we both know. And I think that's that's something that the listeners of this podcast should really, really take to heart, because I think if they're being prescribed antibiotics, they should question that prescription. Do I really need it? And it would save their years of damage. We don't even know what the damage that we're doing with these antibiotics to our gut microbiome in the long term.
Well, what I'd like, I think one way to deal with this is to let everyone know what their risk is of antibiotics, because there's a growing evidence that there's a personalized response to antibiotics. So we don't all react the same way, our gut microbes. So, now that with my company Zoe, we've got like 250,000 people's gut health results. And a lot of them do come and say, well, I've been on antibiotics when I retested, and so we tell them not to take antibiotics for sort of 3 months before, because it'll mess up the results, but a few of them still do. And we see a very different response in some people to others. So some people will recover really fast. Within a couple of weeks, they've bounced back, and others can take a year before they're back to normal.
A year?
Yes.
After taking antibiotics?
Yes.
Their gut doesn't recover for a year?
Yeah, I mean, my co-founder, Jonathan Wolf, he took antibiotics. He had a crushed fracture of his foot. He had to take antibiotics. And he dramatically lost about 40% of his diversity and his good bugs. And it's taken him a year to get back to where he was. So if people knew if they were at high risk or low risk, I think that would also change their, it's like knowing, you're allergic to something, or, you take more care about how quickly your gut responds to a standard antibiotic. And, I think we're not far off being able to tell people what risk category they are. But for the moment, everyone should be, really conscious about it. One of the biggest questions I get is, I've had to take antibiotics, what do I do to counteract it? And this is something the medical profession has no answer for.
Right.
Because most of the medical profession don't know about the gut microbiome.
Right.
We're not taught about it. There aren't enough teachers out there, and it's fast moving.
Right.
And, my advice generally is, throw everything you can at it, like
exactly.
Just have gut-friendly food. Above all, as many fermented foods as you possibly can to build up your gut microbes, and hope for the best. But I think we're going to see more and more of this area being absolutely crucial, and people starting to count how many courses of antibiotics they've had in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Did they take, some probiotic or fermented food while they're on it? And then as these gut tests, get more common, people will actually track it a bit like blood pressure or other things. So they'll have annual checkups and they'll see, okay, it's gone down. That's because I did X and Y, or I didn't do X and Y.
Right. I think that's such great advice. As I've been learning more about the gut microbiome, and like you said, you learned zero about this in medical school. And I think still there's very few medical schools that teach the current physicians that are training about the gut microbiome and its importance. And so I think there's going to be a long time before the medical profession really espouses the knowledge that's out there on this.
And even gastroenterologists,
absolutely,
who should be specializing in this stuff, are not taught it.
Right.
And so, patients will go and see them, and and the average one will just not know the latest research in this field. It's not yet become part of current practice. So you've got to seek someone out who does know about the ins and outs of the gut microbiome. And there are some countries. I mean, I worked and lived a bit in France, and there is a culture of giving out probiotics when you take antibiotics and these sort of things. So at least, this part of medical practice to discuss it with your patients.
I agree. So for those who don't know much about the importance of the microbiome, could you give us like a laundry list maybe of some of the top 5 or 6 things that we need to think about why the microbiome is important? What is it doing there for us, living in our colon, our intestines? Why do we need to make sure our microbiome stays healthy?
I think it's important to conceptualize what the gut microbiome is. So it's very hard to think of these, 100 trillion microbes there. Most of it in our lower part of our intestine, the colon, although they're all over our body, but big concentration where we think the action is mainly right down there. We talk about bacteria, but they're related species called archaea. There's viruses, there's fungi, there's parasites, and they're all working in a sort of eco community, a bit like, an eco environment, and working with each other. And the way to think of them is like mini pharmacies.
Mm-hmm.
They all got different genes and different makeups, but the thing they all have in common is they produce chemicals. They're chemical factories, and they're pumping these out. Some of them are things we know, like vitamins that are really essential for us. The B vitamins mainly come from our gut.
Mm.
They produce brain chemicals,
Mm-hmm.
such as the serotonins and the things that supply dopamine, things like GABA, which are the sort of anti-anxiety things like you get with Valium.
Mm-hmm.
They're also key chemicals. They produce short-chain fatty acids, which are absolutely crucial for our immune system. So they're signaling to all the immune cells, which most people don't realize, but 70% of our immune system is in our gut.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there because it's interacting with these microbes. This is all stuff we've only recently found out.
Yeah.
So these chemicals are making sure that the immune system is reacting appropriately. It's not overreacting and causing allergy or autoimmune disease. It's not underreacting and allowing infections to occur. And it's balancing this, when it goes overboard, you get inflammation, irritation, and it sends out these sort of warning signals to the whole body.
Mm-hmm.
So key chemicals to make sure that that's dampened down. And then you've got other ones signaling about appetite and metabolism. We think that the microbes do play a role in when you feel full and interacting with the normal human gut hormones.
Right.
And so there's as food is going down the gut, they're all signaling to each other. Probably higher up in the gut, they're signaling about glucose response, metabolism. And I think once you start thinking of this way, you say, well, is there really anything they don't do?
Right, exactly.
Because they affect mental health, your metabolic health, your cardiac health, the way you respond to food, pretty much everything, and getting rid of toxins, dealing with things that shouldn't be in your gut. So they really just about do everything. And there's also data showing that the majority of pharmaceuticals you put in your gut, your microbes will deal with them. And depending on what makeup of microbes you've got, they'll metabolize them in different ways.
Interesting.
So simple, that many people take Tylenol, but it doesn't work very well in some people. And they might prefer, ibuprofen instead. And it turns out that's just the microbes are, in some people, deactivating the analgesic properties of the acetaminophen. So antidepressants is another one. They don't work in up to 50% of people because in many people, the microbes they have are deactivating it. So I think we're going to also see that, because they're, if you start reducing everything to chemicals,
right,
and you see pharmaceuticals as chemicals, but you also see food as chemicals, which, in the new way of thinking about food is not just fats, sugars, proteins, calories. It's approaching 100,000 different chemicals.
Biological signals, chemicals, right?
And they're just broken down, and the microbes see them just as chemicals, the same way you see pharmaceuticals. It all starts to make sense.
Yeah.
And that's why the gut microbiome is so crucial to everything from brain chemicals to our immune system. And, we ignore it at our peril. It seems to be probably the most important organ in our bodies that ancient, Indian medicine recognized this without being able to see them.
Right.
And I think this is, some of the Chinese as well. So I think we're coming a bit full circle here. And Western medicine has got to get to grip on something that we've only really discovered in the last 20 years.
Right.
To be quite so crucial to everything that we've sort of ignored before. And
seems like a large missing piece of the puzzle that we've just now discovered.
Yeah, and it's hard for scientists and physicians to start changing the whole way of thinking about the body, how to treat it. And we have to start thinking about everything that's good for you has to be good for your gut health and your gut microbes, and ignoring our diet as we've been doing and hoping that just by therapies and magic bullets and, just vitamin supplements, we can ignore the key essence of our health, because there's no doubt, I was a geneticist for 25 years. Give me a DNA sample or give me a poop sample, I can tell how healthy you are so much better from your microbiome poop sample than from your DNA.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, that's a huge change, and we need to just start realizing this. And I think it's the best indicator of everything that's going on in your body. If that's right, everything else is going to be right. If that's wrong, it's going to be really hard for you to fix it.
Well, that's so powerful. I mean, just to highlight in the way that you did, I'm hoping that the listeners of the podcast really take that to heart, that the gut microbiome has more to do with your health than your genetics do. And therefore, it's really important to, number one, treat it well. Number two, don't destroy it with antibiotics and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And we'll talk about ultra-processed food and all these things that we do to our gut, we're not even realizing how damaging it is to our microbiome. And then lastly, I mean, that's the first place to look. If there's some chronic disease or something, that a diagnosis you might have that people can't figure out, looking at the gut and the gut bacteria, the microbiome specifically, could hold some answers there.
Well, nearly always it does. And we've done studies, we did studies on our twins looking at their gut microbiome, and 100 different diseases. And in nearly all of them, people who had most disease had the more abnormal gut microbes. So there was hardly anything that wasn't associated to some degree. But, particularly looking at things like our modern epidemic of allergies,
Sure.
Epidemic of irritable bowel syndrome, reflux, esophagitis, things that didn't really occur, 50 years ago.
Right.
It can all be traced to, anxiety, depression, all of them traced to abnormalities in the gut microbiome, which then said, well, why is that? Well, it's all directly related to diet and how we've been getting things wrong, and sort of ignoring the major impact of food as a medicine. And I think we hoped that technology would get around that. And I think that was this sort of naive view. When we were at medical school, it was you could surgery and technology would get through everything.
Fix through everything, right?
And, we'd just be eating food out of pouches and, like in Star Trek, and it would all be fine,
Right.
And we just got it so wrong. And the important thing is that unlike genetics, however bad your gut microbiome is, if you're listening now and you're suffering from, as probably most people are, some chronic disease,
right.
Everyone can improve their gut microbiome in just a few days. And, what we're seeing with people who do improve their gut microbiome is dramatic improvements in things they didn't expect. So mood and energy are the two things we see that no doctor actually asks about.
Right.
It wasn't on our
Those
list.
Those two questions, they're not on the symptoms list. How's your mood? How's your energy, right?
It's not there, is it?
And it should be the first two things we ask.
So we need to change that, because that's the thing. If people listen to their body more, they'd realize that, when they start eating properly and their gut health improves, the chemicals those microbes are producing are the things that are really going to change their perception of their health and their energy. And that was the big learning thing for me when we did these studies with Zoe, where we used personalized nutrition to improve their diets. In a way, by chance, we started seeing the biggest effects were on mood and energy, which we hadn't meant to measure.
Yeah.
And so people were reporting it, so we started adding it in. And then, within 2 or 3 days, this is what people were reporting. And so we started then designing trials to actually measure it.
Yeah, that's great.
And it came out. So, and I was, guilty as anyone of not even thinking of, oh, well, no, you just put, weight and cholesterol and blood pressure, these sort of standard things. Because no one can measure, mood or energy, but you can actually do it, especially with the modern age of apps and daily logging and things. These things have become routine, whereas in the past, with a questionnaire every 6 months, they were pretty meaningless.
Right. I think definitely the apps in having just a device with a questionnaire on it that you can answer every day, you get so much better data, better resolution, because the memory questionnaires that we used to use, no one remembers what their mood was like the last 6 months.
And it was totally biased.
Totally biased.
Yeah, by all kinds of other factors.
Exactly.
So we were told to ignore pretty much everything in a questionnaire. Well, it was like, oh, that's all rubbish. What does the patient know? They're just making it up. Whereas if you ask every day, it's sort of, there's much less bias.
Absolutely.
And people will answer honestly. So I think that's something where
powerful.
This new technology has really changed how medicine is being applied.
So I think it's important to make that mental leap from having gut dysbiosis or having your gut bacteria, gut viruses, your microbiome not be healthy, making the mental leap that that's not just a gut issue. Maybe you have some bloating, maybe you have diarrhea, constipation, irritable bowel. It can also lead to psychological disturbances, mood disturbances, energy, lack of energy, and other chronic diseases, metabolic disease, which then is the root cause of heart disease and even neurodegenerative disease in the future. So I think having that realization that your microbiome has a lot to do with all aspects of your health, not just your gut health, is important.
I think so. And I think we're changing our views. I certainly am about there is actually some common ground. You've mentioned all kinds of things that seem rather disparate.
Right.
How are they connected? Well, there is the immune system does connect it all. And I think I'm coming to the realization that if the immune system is not perfectly tuned, you're going to get low-grade inflammation. And low-grade inflammation is this idea that the body's slightly under attack. It can't be in a totally relaxed mode. It thinks it's got to fight something. So it's looking for a fight. And it's like there's some smoldering embers all over the body that's trying to put the fire out. And that affects your mood. It's been associated with depression. It's been associated with dementia. It's been associated with anxiety. It's your cardiac risk. It's your risk of autoimmune diseases. You increase your risk of cancer because your immune system's distracted. It can't fight things. And so more and more, suddenly, this picture of all these chronic diseases are related to our immune system being just slightly out of whack for whatever reason. And our microbiome is the main controller of that. So it starts to build up this very holistic picture of medicine that, I think we'd completely forgotten.
Right.
Or thought there was no link between any of these things. There was no link between the heart or the gut or the brain. And yet we see that's absolutely not true. And the current science is telling us absolutely that this low-level inflammation that probably everyone in the US has to some extent.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whether it's through pollution, bad diet, stress, drugs, whatever, that they didn't have maybe 50, 60 years ago, is causing such a strain on the body that all these other events are happening because our normal repair mechanisms are a bit overwhelmed. And I think if you start thinking in a very broad sense like that, it starts to make sense. And realizing that, there are anti-inflammatory remedies, a good night's sleep and meditation, stress, relief, bit of exercise, but predominantly diet can change all that. I think is probably the most important message we can give to people, and that you cannot ignore what's going into your gut.
You started your career as a rheumatologist, you were saying, and so that's a specialist in the immune system, and you saw all sorts of diseases. I myself suffered from a autoimmune disease 20 years ago, and it was really addressing my gut that I think was the key factor in reversing my autoimmune disease. And so I'm curious from your perspective how gut health and autoimmunity tie together. And do you think this low-level inflammation predisposes you to some of the common autoimmune diseases?
I think autoimmune disease definitely have a genetic component. So I'm not a genetic denier. I mean, I was a geneticist for a long time, and it does run in families. But it's one thing to have the gene, but not every, we were studying twins, and if one twin had rheumatoid arthritis, which is a well-known autoimmune arthritis, the other identical twin with the same genes only had about a 1 in 5 chance of also having it. So 4 times out of 5, they wouldn't get it.
Right.
So there was some other factor. And I think that other factor was something that would trigger their immune system, which might have been an infection. It might have been their gut microbiome secreting the wrong chemicals, things like this. So often it was a 2-stage process, that there's a genetic predisposition, but if you had the right lifestyle, you would never get that disease. So I think that to me is where we're heading in terms of our ideas of the etiology behind these conditions, and why a lot of them are increasing.
Right.
In that the genes have already been there; they haven't changed, But our modern lifestyle is making it more likely that those genes are going to be switched on in somebody.
Sure.
And that's why we see more inflammatory bowel disease. And autoimmune disease is, what used to be rare, perhaps more severe disease is much more common mainstream problems that we're just seeing everywhere.
Yeah.
And but the good news is that I think a lot of them can be helped with diet.
Right.
And most of my career, that was always dismissed as quackery.
Right.
Partly because they did just use, a good example is aubergines and tomatoes.
Yeah.
So eggplants and tomatoes
Sure.
were seen as the demons of, rheumatoid arthritis.
Right.
And so people would say, oh, you can't eat that, deadly nightshades.
Right. Nightshades.
And that was proven to be rubbish.
Yeah.
And so that gave the whole diet idea into mainstream medicine just said that's a load of nonsense.
Right.
And threw everything out.
Yeah.
So the idea of actually sort of improving diet and then that
threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. So I think we need to now redress that and say, actually, listen, a good diet has been shown to improve inflammation. There's been some good studies recently of fermented foods.
Yeah.
If you take 3 to 5 portions of fermented food, within 2 weeks, your inflammatory markers will drop. Now, that's equivalent to taking low-dose steroids.
Yeah.
So why doesn't every doctor recommend that?
Right.
So we need to start just to relearn our medicine and say, obviously having food rather than steroids makes sense,
Makes much better sense, right?
And just emphasize the importance, of good food in all our diets.
Yeah. I think we've said diet many times, and it's really an important concept to always start with modifying your diet. And when I talk to my patients about the key things that they need to think about when modifying their diet, number one, I would say, which leads to an automatic improvement in your diet overall, is just completely swearing off ultra-processed food. Just removing 90% of the ultra-processed food from your diet and aiming for 100%. I think that's critical. And I would love to hear, I've heard you speak in other podcasts about ultra-processed foods and some of the damaging effects of it. I'd love for you to talk about that right now. What is ultra-processed food specifically, and why is it so damaging?
So ultra-processed food doesn't have a clear-cut definition as yet. So people use different ones.
Right. I think that's what makes it confusing for people too.
And the food companies have deliberately kept it that way.
Exactly.
They spread misinformation.
Yeah.
And they love the fact that experts can't agree on it.
No.
But it is fake food. It's food that's taken from extracts of real food and put together using glues, emulsifiers, flavorers, sweeteners, preservatives, everything to change the shape, taste, texture, smell, color of that food so it resembles what looks like real food.
Right.
So it's fake food that has enormous amounts of extra additives and chemicals to disguise it.
Right.
And they have certain properties that make them particularly unhealthy. So first is they generally lack nutrition. They lack fiber. And that's because if they had fiber in it, people wouldn't eat as much of them.
Exactly.
So they want to sell more.
Right.
They have high levels of fat, sugar, and salt. And they do that because that makes you eat more of them. And so happens to they use the cheapest types of fat,
Sure.
so the palm oils and the coconut oils and really bad fats that are bad for you, because not all fats are bad for you. And they also make it like baby food.
Right.
So it
easily digested.
It takes nothing to eat it, and so you can consume it super fast.
Right.
And before your brain has got an idea that you've just consumed hundreds of calories, you're on to your next one and the next one, and you're finishing the whole packet or the bag or whatever it is. So they designed to dissolve like instantly in your mouth and have no fiber that ever reaches your gut microbes. So, and that means that the sugar and the fat is getting instantly into your bloodstream without really having to trouble your intestine really at all. And so you keep eating them. And this means you're eating, studies have suggested 25% more, calorie equivalents.
Yeah.
And so they're contributing massively to the obesity crisis. And then finally, you've got all the chemicals that are in there.
Yeah, that's true too.
Because the one thing that does get down to your gut microbes are all these extra chemicals.
Right.
And these are these glues, the emulsifiers, which make your microbes stick together, the preservatives, which can kill off your microbes, and things like the artificial sweeteners, which we know also disrupt them. And all of these also affect the gut lining. So more likely to make it leaky and stop it working normally, which you need for this really important immune function. And so it's a combination of all these things are in the perfect ultra-processed food, which is what, at least 60% of American meals are made up of.
At least, yeah.
And it's higher in kids. It's over 70% in children. And as you go into, more deprived, poorer groups, it gets above 95%.
Because it's cheaper.
It is much cheaper. It's much more convenient. It never goes off. There's nothing real, so it doesn't ever get moldy. And, and that's why 7-Eleven sort of exists, because they don't really need fridges or anything.
They don't need fridges or anything, right?
Yeah, but it's costing, taxpayer a fortune in ill health and obesity. And unlike the cigarette, it's to my mind the same as cigarette manufacturers.
Absolutely, yeah.
They should be paying for all the damage they're doing to people, and that money should be given back to the real food has a fair chance of being sold to people who struggle to afford it. But we reached crisis point here, and I think we are at a moment where governments are starting to talk about this, and hopefully the power of the big food companies is waning, because they spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying, stopping any legislation, saying, well, you free choice and all this kind of stuff. But it's the same argument about alcohol and cigarettes. It's terrible. And unfortunately, the US is leading the world in bad food.
Yeah, I know. It's just, I think it's really interesting to see that what the food companies, I mean, these are massive corporations. I don't think people realize how massive they are. There's 5 or 6 companies that own almost all the food that we eat in the Western world. And these companies have, like you said, tremendous amounts of budget. And so a lot of this budget is used to hire scientists to trick us into eating more food. There's a lot of marketing misinformation spread. I even think, just even the labels on food that have calories on them, it's a way to trick us into thinking, oh, it's a low-calorie food, so I think maybe this might be better for me. But in reality, just the fact that they're able to quantify the calories but still trick you into eating more of it because of the additional flavorings and texturizers, it's just
added
all a
vitamins.
Trick. They added vitamins, right?
You go to any cereal packet aimed at children, and you'd think this is the most healthy thing they could possibly eat.
Fruit Loops, for example. What is a Fruit Loop? No one can tell you what is a Fruit Loop. It's made out of what?
A Fruit Loop tree.
Exactly, the Fruit Loop tree. Yeah, it's terrible.
And it's got low calorie, low fat, might say gluten-free, high in protein, source of fiber, and you got a list of vitamins on there, and it's complete junk because it's 30% sugar.
Right.
And people are being conned, and you talk to the general public and they might think, oh, it's not that bad for the kids. I chose the one with the more vitamins on it. It's totally misleading. These health halos, and it's the same with, you go to the children's dairy section, or you think some parents might say, oh, I'll give my children's yogurt. That's healthy. And they've got low fat. Low fat is a warning sign. That's an unhealthy food. People should be educated that the more health claims on a packet, the more you should avoid it.
The more it's a trick.
Correct. You should be, but they shouldn't be allowed to do it. And other countries around the world are changing. A lot of the South American countries where they have massive obesity problems as well, they have blanket bans on children's products having these fake claims. And I think that's the first thing that a respectable government should do, is to stop people being conned.
Yeah.
They want to buy something that's unhealthy. That's fair enough, but don't pretend it is something it isn't.
Yeah, and don't allow, especially advertising to our children with cartoons on boxes, to trick our kids into choosing foods that are more harmful to them than good to them, right?
Yeah, and several countries have gone and banned the cartoons, and they, in the same way that cigarettes moved from having nice pictures of cowboys, sort of on their smoking to now they've got pictures of death and things. I mean, I'm not there yet with the cereals, but you can see that's where it should be going.
It should be going that way.
But as you said, the big companies have got, they can buy politicians, they can buy influencers. I get attacked on social media, and I'm fairly sure a lot of these people are paid by big food corporations
for sure
to muddy the water, to say no one's clear about what's going on. Is this an ultra-processed food? You're not really sure, and just trying to keep things as they are, because they're making billions and billions every year out of our bad health.
Yes,
it's a total disgrace, and they should be paying for it. But they're incredibly powerful. But I think the tide has turned. I am optimistic now that we've got as bad as it's going to get, and we saw for the first time, in the last election here, people talking about food for the first time.
Right.
Other than we should eat more beef, that was which, in the past has been certainly a thing in Texas, but, so suddenly people are saying, we can do something about it. It is a disgrace. So, yeah, I'm optimistic that things can improve now and that people, are ready for change.
It's interesting you say that thing about social media, because when I post something about ultra-processed food, there are certain people that jump down my throat about what's the proof and where is this really being made? And I think those people are hired by these food corporations to create confusion with social media commentary. And it's very obvious to me. There's no question that ultra-processed food is bad for you. Let's not mince words. It is what it is, and you can try to.
We don't have all the details, but it's. I lived through the time when passive smoking was being. I was studying epidemiology then. It was exactly the same. We all knew the passive smoking, which is driving being in a car with smokers, or in a restaurant or whatever, where you're surrounded by smoke all the time, had some health effects. Now we couldn't exactly quantify how much it was. But the smoking industry paid all these people to confuse the issue. And anyone who's standing up there now on social media who is defending ultra-processed food and say there's no evidence, chances are, as you said, they're just paid lackeys of the food companies. And so are the politicians who are also standing up for them.
Yeah.
And, we should be arguing, okay, we know it's bad. We need to know more details. Let's fund the big studies to do this, but not just pretend it's not a problem.
Exactly. And I think also people need to realize that food has many more qualities that we don't even know that are healthy for us. And so, there's thousands actually of phytochemicals in our vegetables that you only get from whole food. You cannot find and individually figure out every single one and then add it back into a processed food. That's just not, there's no way that's going to happen. And there's such a long tail of these that there's no way we're going to even know what all of them are. So why not just eat real food? Because then you're going to get everything that's good for you.
Absolutely. I think, the last few years we saw this reductionism.
Exactly.
So that people would take one food and say, okay, there's only one thing good about that, right? So red wine, there's only one thing good, resveratrol, right? So we went obsessed and say, okay, instead of red wine or a grape, you just have this
pill of
tablet.
resveratrol.
Instead of a carrot, you take carotene, right? And so, but hang on, there's 840 other chemicals in carrots that we don't know anything about that are likely to be, food for our gut microbes that will then allow them to produce some amazing chemicals that will be good for us. And you're so right. We have to realize that food is this rich, hundreds of thousands of different chemicals that we can eat. And the more different ones we're feeding our gut microbes, the more defense chemicals they can make. It's like giving them all the tools. And any idea to reduce this to, one powder, one vitamin, one, or it can be made industrially, is just absolute nonsense.
Yeah, you get asked all the time, what's the best protein powder? What's the best fiber supplement? I'm like, the best protein powder is a piece of salmon, and the best fiber supplement is eating your broccoli.
Yeah, because we don't know yet.
Right, we don't know yet.
We've only got a fraction of the knowledge about what it is in real food that actually helps our microbes produce those chemicals that most yet we still don't know about that really boost our health. So yeah, why take a chance? What on some manufacturer saying, I know the answer.
Exactly.
It's the single one.
Right.
I'm ignoring all the others, the other 99%.
Yeah.
Just have this one. Yeah. So that's a mindset though, but humans are suckers for the magic bullet, aren't they?
We are, aren't we?
We've all been there. And so we, just take that, that pill, that will do it. Don't have to worry about anything else. And I think, there are some vitamins, for example, that are useful.
Sure.
But the vast majority are not. And my big worry is that anyone who's into vitamins is doing it because they're not interested in real food.
Absolutely.
And so it's their alternative. And so that whole industry is there really to sort of say food doesn't matter. And that really is the worst kind of messaging to get out there.
Yeah, I agree with you. One of the unsung heroes and things that we rarely talk about, because I think there's very little money in it, is fiber. And I feel that it's such an important component of food. And, there's a lot of talk about protein. There's a lot of talk about, maybe fats, right? And low fat versus what are good fats and bad fats. But rarely do you hear about fiber. And I'm curious, why is that? And how much should people think about fiber?
Well, the reason is that food manufacturers don't want us to be talking about fiber.
Because it keeps us full.
Yes. There was a great story. I was in Spain and I was talking to some beer manufacturers and they did an experiment. They said, can we make our beer healthier? So they did a test brew and they added fiber to the beer. And people quite liked the taste. It was no different. But then they worked out that they were drinking less of it.
Wow.
So
they didn't want to talk about that.
They abandoned it. And so that got buried. But that makes you think. You say, well, because our food is has these sort of 10 companies, they want us to eat more. They don't want us to be healthier. They've got shareholders, they're just doing what any company would do. Why would you produce something that makes you have less of it? Unless it was for 3 times the price or something. And they know their competitors will be able to sell more, and they're always worried about their competitors. So logically, fiber doesn't feature. For these companies, they want to cut it out. It's really bad for them. And so that's the thing we're fighting. And it turns out that most of the high fiber products are very cheap and there's no great margin in them.
Right.
So they don't do it. And until they get help from government or whatever, this is always going to be a bit of a problem. Where are people supporting beans? Beans, a great source of protein, and they've got fiber. It is a major problem. And in the US, 95% of people are deficient in fiber.
95%?
Yes.
Almost everybody.
Nearly everybody is getting enough fiber, yeah.
Sure.
And yet most people worry about protein. And the evidence is that 90% of Americans are getting enough protein.
Right.
And so why? Well, manufacturers make all that money on protein snacks and protein shakes and protein drinks and making everyone insecure about their protein.
Right.
Oh, the reason you're not muscular is you're not getting protein. And yet, some people are getting so much protein, they're just peeing it out, or it just goes to converted to fat.
Exactly.
Because you can't store protein.
Exactly.
But it's marketing driven.
Yeah.
It is, it's a sad state of affairs. But I think if people learn more about the gut microbiome and realize that they thrive on fiber, and in the US, generally microbes are being starved of fiber.
Right.
If people are having mainly, ultra processed meals and junk food, etc., they will start to. We can get people to start thinking differently, and that's very much, one of my missions and in life, and why we founded Zoe is to start getting people thinking about food differently.
Right.
Move away from this obsession with calories, obsession with low fats. All carbs are bad. All these fad diets, these exclusion diets.
Right.
Realize that more is better, and that diversity of food is better, and get people eating whole foods. Because it's the range of fibers. There are hundreds of different types of fiber.
Sure.
We understand very little about them, but we do know that they're amazing fuel for our microbes. And then, of course, as well as fiber, the other thing that comes with real foods is polyphenols.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, I think you call them, phytonutrients, which just means, in Greek, plant nutrients. But these defense chemicals that you get in real food that you don't get in ultra-processed foods, that give the bitterness and the color to everything we're eating, that we used to think of antioxidants, and that's what we were taught at medical school. They magically get into your blood and sort of calm everything down.
Right.
It was like sort of tranquilizers for your blood. Turns out that was rubbish.
Yeah.
And most of their effect is via the gut microbes.
Oh.
Our body can't use most of these polyphenols.
Oh.
We taste them in our mouth.
Right.
We have a glass of olive oil. That gives you that cough, that slightly bitter flavors, but incredibly important for our gut microbes. So
our gut microbiomes are using the polyphenols and creating chemicals for us that are beneficial.
Yeah, and the plants use them to defend themselves, to stop them dying in the sun or the wind or the cold or against other bugs and things. And that's why these fresh plants and vegetables are so good for us, why nuts and seeds are so good for us, why olive oil, chocolate, coffee, all these things that we were maybe told were bad for us end up being actually good for us because they have these really high levels of these polyphenols.
Yeah, no one's adding polyphenols to ultra-processed foods. There's this.
Well, they probably will.
They will eventually try to do this.
On the cereal packets,
with polyphenols.
Now with added polyphenols. That's right. But it'll be the worst kind, the cheapest ones, and it probably won't have anything real in it because no one's checking up on them. They can put anything they like on those labels.
I want to break down fiber a little bit more because you mentioned there are many different types of fiber, and there's insoluble and soluble fiber. Can you talk about how someone can think about fiber and the different types of fiber and how they can get them into their diet more?
Yeah, well, they're broadly categorized as insoluble and soluble, which means when you add water to them, they mix up or they go right through. Now, both types are helpful. So we mustn't always think of any one type. And again, we mustn't be guilty of this reductionism.
Right.
Just say, okay, there's only one thing I need this one type of fiber. You can commercially buy about 80 types of fiber.
80.
80,
okay.
I don't know the names of them, but and there's very few fiber experts, even academically, to work this out. And we still don't really understand how they're used by the body. So at the moment, the best way to think about fiber is to get a diversity of fiber sources, not rely on just one, and not rely on any ultra-processed forms of fiber, so the bran flake cereals or something like that, which would probably only have a rather limited amounts of fiber, and get them from as many different plants as you can. But realize that many things have fiber in them that you didn't envisage. So it turns out that the average American gets about a third of their fiber intake from coffee.
Coffee.
Yeah.
Brewed coffee.
Yes.
Yeah.
So again, and there'd be more fiber, in a cup of coffee than a glass of orange juice.
Right. Wow.
So sometimes one's ideas of where fiber comes from is a bit distorted.
Yeah.
So you've got to realize, coffee comes from a bean. That bean is fermented, and if you have 3 cups of coffee, that will give you, 4 to 5 grams of fiber a day, which is about a third of the average, US intake.
Yeah.
So you've got to start changing your idea of where fiber comes from.
Right.
So you get it from beans. Bread contains fiber. And so in the US, again, bread is probably the primary source of fiber. But at the same time, you're getting at a high cost of a lot of sugar.
Right. A lot of carbohydrate, sugar.
So whereas you don't want to stop eating the fiber, you want to shift to look at your bread to see, can you get a bread that has a higher fiber content and a lower sugar content? And so starting to look at the grams of fiber on the back of your pack is a really good way to see how healthy something is. And also, if you're going to eat it, is it going to fill you up more?
Right.
Because the other important thing about fiber is that, as well as being good for your gut microbes, it signals fullness much quicker than anything else. It's even more than protein. It's really important. So getting that balance of fiber to sugars is really important.
Yeah. And I think some people, they advocate looking at the nutritional content on the back of bread or whatever you're buying, and doing a little calculation on fiber versus the amount of carbohydrate total, right? And so the closer that your total carbohydrates is mainly made of fiber, the better that food is going to be.
Yeah. And
fiber-wise.
That's right. And, so I've sort of slowly progressed to having rye bread.
Yeah. Rye bread is a great source of fiber.
And it has relatively little sugar, and so the ratio is really good. But you can get other ones that look fantastic on a supermarket shelf, and they've got all the health halos all over it.
All the marketing.
Nuts and seeds and, pictures of wheat and all this kind of stuff. And you actually look at it and you say, wow, you've got, 40 grams of sugar in there, and you got like 2 grams of fiber, that's not a good ratio.
No.
And so, but it's really hard for consumers.
It is.
Because they don't make it easy for you to pick that out. And in a lot of places, fiber is not compulsory to put on many labels. And so, you have to really look for it.
Yeah, I think bread is a huge source of confusion for people, because for a long time, people thought they were being healthy by buying brown bread. But in reality, brown bread has a minimal additional fiber in it, but it's still a lot of sugar. And,
it's often dyed anyway.
It's not, exactly. It's often fake brown, right?
It was fake brown. You just add a bit of carrot juice to it, and it suddenly goes brown. And and people are, being conned all the time, by clever marketing.
How do you feel about sourdough bread?
Well, most of it is fake.
That's terrible.
If you make it yourself, You know, it's not fake. You've actually gone through and I do make my own. But I am very careful. I'm going to buy sourdough bread. Most of the stuff in supermarkets is fake. They don't have to. They've done some studies recently showing that they can find chemical yeast in them. And to call it sourdough bread, you just have to have a bit of dried sourdough flour,
really,
sprinkled in it. There's no strict guidelines of what makes sourdough bread. So unfortunately, again, the big food manufacturers have zoomed in on a health trend and said, okay, so most of it's fake, but if you can get the real stuff, studies show that it is better for you. Provided, though, you still haven't got this massive sugar to fiber ratio. So it doesn't mean you don't have to look on the back of the pack. But if you get a good one and it's high in fiber, then there's evidence that for people who are even gluten intolerant, sensitive, the fact that the sourdough fermentation has broken the proteins into small amounts does allow them to eat it. So it's easy to digest. Right. But I think the main reason to eat it is it's once you've eaten good sourdough bread, it's so much nicer than chemical bread, and it's the old-fashioned way of we all used to eat it, and it's also made with care. Yeah. So it's more expensive. It takes longer to, you got to ferment it overnight, and this is something that's been created properly rather than just churned out in 90 minutes in a factory. Right. That has nothing to it. But but making your own is great fun as well.
That's a lot of fun.
There's some evidence that people who make their own are actually healthier. And it's maybe just you get all these microbes on your hands and they get into your mouth, so that they've worked out that the gut microbes and the hand microbes of bakers are actually healthier.
Interesting. That's so interesting. So for those I got my first Zoe kit maybe 8 years ago. It's been a long time that you've had Zoe.
Wow, you got one of the prototypes back then.
Like I think it was a yellow box, and I remember getting it, and then
it's still yellow.
It's still yellow. Okay, and I remember back then it was just a gut microbiome test and some literature, but then since then I've seen another one, and now you're including a continuous glucose monitor as well as part of the Zoe kit that people can order. Can you talk a little bit about why you added that piece in there, and maybe the whole Zoe kit in general? Because I think it's number one, it's a beautiful kit, and it gives you so much incredible information. I'd love for you to kind of walk us through the thought process around the Zoe process.
Yeah. So, unlike most companies, we spent the first 3 years just doing research.
Right.
So most health and wellness companies spend all their money on marketing and then work out, what the message is going to be afterwards. But because I was a scientist, I forced the other two guys to go out and get the money to really do the science. And so we studied 1,000 people, mainly twins, in great detail. We did another parallel study in the US and learned really what was going on. And we realized that you needed a gut health measurement was fine, but it didn't, on its own, it didn't tell you enough about personalizing nutrition. So we wanted to come up with a test that would allow us to really personalize your nutrition. So gut health was fine. It's going to tell you something about your general health, but it really on its own wasn't quite enough. So we realized that when we did this study, we gave 1,000 people identical cookies at exactly the same time of the day. It would be high in sugar, high in fat, and we saw their glucose response to it and their fat response to it. And they varied tenfold between people.
Tenfold.
Which was
massive.
Wow. I had no idea. I imagined maybe 2 or 3-fold, possibly, at most. So to see this tenfold variation it wasn't just random, it was, consistent. Said, obviously we need, if you're reacting, so some people are reacting to carbs, some people were reacting to fats. They couldn't clear the fats after 6 hours. Others could easily. So some people could deal with fats, some people could deal with carbs. So we saw, even when we tested identical twins, got different results. So genetics played virtually no role in this, which was, for me, a bit of a shock.
Yeah,
because
that is
I'm
shocking,
Mr. Twin guy, so everything's genetic. So I got that wrong, because we were going to include genetics in our test originally. Sure. So we scrapped genetics because it didn't work in identical twins. They're the perfect.
Why would you even look at it, right?
Exactly.
How are you measuring the fat response?
We looked at something called triglycerides.
Sure, of course.
Which is something that goes up and down with food. And normally at 6 hours, it should be cleared from the body.
Got it.
And should have gone to the liver and be repackaged and circulated. And so in some people, in about a third of people, we saw the triglyceride was still hanging around in there, which meant that you're getting inflammation in those blood vessels, and that would be that chronic inflammation you'd be getting that we talked about could be so important. Similarly, blood sugar spikes triggering, if you're getting them all the time, every now and again it's not a problem. But if it's happening every day, you're just stimulating your immune system. Right. So these are two things we wanted to avoid. We then combined those two tests with the gut microbiome. That's what we do in that kit.
Right.
And we put that together. That gives us an algorithm which allows us to give you scores for every food. So we predict how you would then respond to every food. And so after that testing phase, you download the app with your scores on it, and then you can log every food just by photo logging now, which is a totally cool feature. So you don't have, you probably did logging manually, which was a real pain. Now you just got to take a photo of it. It tells you exactly what's in the food.
It's incredible.
How much fiber, how much protein, how much, everything about it, all the ingredients, and your score. And the idea is to move people gradually towards getting high-scoring foods. And unlike nearly every other company I know, we actually tested our method against a control group, which was doing the FDA-approved diet, which is restricting calories, low fat. And after 3 months, we saw significant improvements in our group compared to the FDA diet, showing that this combination of gut-friendly foods and pushing people towards foods that would help their gut microbes, plus reducing these sugar and fat spikes, did much better than traditional diets, etc. So and the first thing we noticed in these was improvements in mood and energy within a few days.
Amazing.
And so that obviously that was a few years ago, and we keep evolving our plan and making it better and better, so that it's easier to adhere to. Because there's no point in doing something just for 6 weeks. This isn't a 6-week crash diet. There's plenty of those, or there's injections you have instead. This is something to sustain your health for years. So it's about building healthy habit loops. And it's also about introducing people to new foods. So we encourage people and give bonus scores if you can hit our sort of targets of 30 plants a week, including spices and herbs and nuts and seeds, and you're getting plenty of color on your plate. You get bonuses for fermented foods.
It sounds like a great adjunct if you are on a GLP-1 medication, which many people are now considering, to use this concurrently with your GLP-1 medication to change your relationship with food and understand what foods are actually beneficial for you. Because that time that you're on a GLP-1, you're not craving ultra-processed foods, fast foods, et cetera. So now it's a perfect time period to reform your relationship with food, which Zoe can give you the education you need.
I think that's absolutely right. And, now, statistics are showing that 1 in 6 people in California have sort of used GLP-1s. It is the perfect moment when, as you said, your brain has time to think.
Exactly.
You're not dominated by going to the fridge and or the junk food adverts or whatever. You don't have those cravings.
Right.
You can actually think sensibly about what you want to eat and try to train your body without that ogre sitting there of this incredible dominating appetite.
Absolutely.
Signals coming in there. So I think this is a new era. We have to embrace that, GLP-1s are here to stay, but it's a huge opportunity for many people to use that.
To have behavior change.
To totally change their behavior, get their body used to these new types of food. And they should be able to, and that also allows them potentially to reduce dose, even come off them at some point.
Exactly. Right.
And not be a slave to these drugs for the whole of your life.
Right.
But use this synergistically. So I think you're absolutely right. It's
that'd be a great study to see. One of the biggest problems with GLP-1s is people are told by the pharmaceutical companies that they're going to need to be on them forever because the rate of regaining the weight is pretty much guaranteed. But I think that's 100% due to the fact that they're not using the time period to change their behavior and they're not changing their gut microbiome. And so if you change your behavior and you change your gut microbiome during this time period, which we do at our practice at Next Health, we tie patients with a continuous glucose monitor with dietary recommendations and a nutritionist. We find that almost nobody gains their weight back. And they also don't lose muscle. And they also, actually decrease their cravings for the long term. And another big point I want to make here is that eating a healthy diet actually does work out to be cheaper for you in the long run because you're less hungry. There's less snacking going on. I think people think that there's misconception that eating healthy is expensive. The opposite is true. Is eating too much is expensive. Eating healthy helps you to eat less, which in the long run will save you money.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And what's interesting is all the studies we've done at Zoe, and we are really a science-based company. So whether it was the standard Zoe diet, we've got another one with our prebiotic, which is 30 freeze-dried plants, different ones, in order to improve the diversity. When we gave that in a trial, that people's weight reduced and their hunger reduced. We've just done another study of fermentation,
right?
Giving people at least 3 samples of fermented foods a day in 10,000 people, and they reported reduced hunger pangs. So just by changing the food you're eating, you can do the same things as GLP-1 is doing. So I think it's an incredible opportunity for people, and they should really seize it rather than just being complacent and say, well, I can keep eating this junk. You say, well, take a longer term view. You retrain your body, when you can get free of all these chemicals that are, partly addictive.
They are.
And I think, we think something like 1 in 10 people are actually addicted to these foods. This is a really good way of getting rid of that addiction and getting your body craving real food.
Right.
And then you'll find, as you said, don't need to snack. You can leave a good interval overnight. And that's another thing we encourage at Zoe. We did a study of 100,000 people. We got them all to do time-restricted eating.
100,000 people.
Yes.
I can't wait to hear the results of this one.
So you read all these studies, and of course, they're all done in Stanford or some little lab, and they're all 20-year-old students,
right.
and they're all males. So, it's not, you can't relate to it if you're a middle-aged female.
Sure.
And all sounds too good to be true. So let's do a real life experiment. So we signed up 100,000 citizen scientists and said, do you want to do this study? And all we're asking you to do is have a time window of 14 hours overnight where you're not eating anything. So people had to stop their late night snacking, and they could choose to do it early in the morning or late at night. Didn't, and it turns out that 2/3 chose to cut or delay breakfast. Only 1/3 wanted to have it early, although it's slightly better earlier on. Just it's less convenient. So they all signed up for it. 1/3 couldn't hack it. They said, "No, I'm a snacker. I can't do this." Which you never hear about in trials, right? Sure. They want to say, "Oh, this 100%." So 1/3 of people couldn't do it. 1/3 of people sort of quite liked it, but weren't sure they were going to come. 1/3 loved it, and they're still doing it now.
Yeah.
So I think that gives you an idea. And that 1/3 that did it really well,
right?
They lost weight, they had less hunger, their IBS symptoms improved, they got less bloating, they had more energy, more mood. So lots of things that we can all be doing, not even what you eat, but just how you eat.
Right.
And in the US, average, there are there's now 6 meals a day, apparently, is the average, and 1 in 4 are eaten in the car. So, it's like
crazy. Right.
Whereas all the healthy countries you go to, Mediterranean ones, it's all decent meal times, but, 2 or 3 max.
Right.
That's it. No snacking.
Right. No snacking, right?
So I think that's the other thing to change. If you're on the GLP-1s, that's a perfect time to change not only what you eat, but how you're eating.
Sure. Can we touch on probiotics? You mentioned a probiotic that you were developing, and
prebiotic.
A prebiotic, okay, great.
Which means the fertilizer for the microbes.
Got it. Yeah, let's break that down. Prebiotic versus probiotic versus postbiotic. And do you say Zoe's making a prebiotic?
Yes.
Okay, tell us a little bit about that too.
So we came up with this idea based on the research that we did a while ago, combining the British Gut Project with the American Gut Project.
Okay.
These were volunteers paying for their own gut testing. It was quite an innovative thing about 10 years ago. And it showed that the optimum gut health was for people who ate 30 plants or more, different ones, a week. And it didn't matter if they were meat eaters, fish eaters, vegans, vegetarians, whatever. What mattered was getting that diversity of plants on your plate. And I think that's a really important message.
Sure.
And so we had this, it wasn't a big study, but it was all we had. And 30, we've tried it out, and it rings. It's worked really well in a campaign in the UK. 30 plants. I can remember that.
Yeah.
I can tick it off, and how many have I had in my meals?
Yeah.
And we've started encouraging people to start thinking about adding plants, and just a spoonful of spice counts as one. Coffee is a plant. You can start thinking about plants in very different ways.
Sure.
I have a jar of nuts and seeds in the morning that I add to my yogurt.
Yeah.
That gives me an extra 10 plants.
Right,
It's like, it's not that hard.
No.
And so that was a really important thing. So but a lot of people did find it difficult to do this, or if they're working or they're doing night shifts, to get the 30 plants in, or if they're traveling. So we designed this prebiotic that would give us over 32 plants, including 6 freeze-dried mushrooms. Some interesting ones you wouldn't normally get in your diet, like baobab, unless you go to Africa.
Exactly.
And it also gives you considerable amount of fiber. So you get 5 grams of fiber, which just by 1 scoop of 5 grams of fiber will reduce your risk of death by 14%.
14%. Wow.
That's what the epidemiology studies show. So it's a high fiber, diverse, with plenty of polyphenols, diversity in color, and you just add it to food.
Okay.
So it's not a meal replacement.
Got it.
You just sprinkle it on like you would nuts.
What does
seeds.
it taste like?
It's savory.
Oh, okay, good.
So it tastes like real food, as opposed to these sort of green powders.
Right.
That just taste like chemical green powders. And you can see the bits in it. And because we're a science company, we actually tested it. And against, we had two arms. One was a probiotic arm, and the other was a dummy arm where instead of these granules, we just had little bits of dried bread. And we showed really significant improvements after 12 weeks in the gut microbiome and in most of the symptoms, energy, mood, slight changes in weight, things like this that said, well, this is, it works.
Right.
And so that's why we're keen on, I'd rather eat real food, but if you can add this up, it's like an extra insurance policy for you. And I always take it everywhere I go traveling.
Oh, okay.
So you'll have to try some.
I can't wait to try it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can now buy it in the US.
Oh, okay.
And
what's the name of it?
It's called Daily 30.
Daily 30. Okay. I love it. Yeah. I remember hearing about the 30 campaign a while ago, and it sounded very reasonable to me. It just seemed a little overwhelming. Where am I going to find 30 plants a week?
Yeah.
But then it makes sense when you add in the nuts and the coffee and.
Yeah. I think in a way, this is a good entry into it. It starts you thinking about it. And we want people to do both, but not everyone can always get their 30 in. We're busy. It's not always easy to guarantee it. Always especially if you're traveling.
Sure.
And traveling in the US, you can get some horrible food environments where, you really wish you weren't there and there's nothing else to eat except frozen pizza.
Right.
So that's where you desperately need to be hang this around with you and, give it to your kids who might be reluctant to eat all those plants. They won't notice a bit of a sprinkle of this stuff on them. So it's something that we know improves your gut health, and it worked better than our probiotic.
Interesting.
And the probiotic, as we were talking about, is, that's live microbes.
Sure.
That work in a different way. So the prebiotic is something that you give so that it helps all your natural microbes grow more and get more diversity and produce more good chemicals. A probiotic is a bit of a guesswork that this particular microbe is going to have an effect on your gut in ways we still don't really understand. And it worked a little bit, but again, it comes back to the idea that these probiotics you buy are a bit of a lottery because we all have a very different gut microbiome inside us, and it worked really well in some people and not in others. So at the moment, we think the prebiotics are actually a better bet. But you mentioned postbiotics, and I'm really interested in postbiotics. This idea that a postbiotic means either a dead microbe or the juice of microbes with the microbes extracted from them. And it's a really new concept.
Right.
It's come out of a number of trials where the control group were dead microbes. They'd killed them, they'd pasteurized them, and in at least 3 trials, they found out that it did at least as well as the active one. So how do dead microbes work?
Yeah.
Because this seems nonsense. And
it was discovered by accident.
It was discovered by accident because, nobody sane would think it would work. And then you start to think about it. Well, actually, how do vaccines work?
Right.
These are dead viruses, right? Or dead bacteria. They have an effect on your immune system. And we know, you feel different after a vaccination. And so they are having this effect. And increasingly, I think we're going to start seeing this. And, we've got some plans to add this to our Daily 30.
Nice.
And, we need to do the same trials to show that it's working. But I think I'm super excited by this idea because it means that there's less safety concerns.
Sure.
They last a long time.
Right.
And some of the products that, are used like kombuchas and so a lot of these drinks that can't really be live because they're in a can that's been there for 6 months. And, if it was live, it'd just explode.
Exactly.
So they've killed them.
Right.
But they could still be healthy.
They could still work, right? If it's postbiotic effect.
Yeah, just a year ago, I would be saying they're nonsense, don't drink them.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Actually, just by having some dead microbes floating around also means that, some things like beers, yeasty beers, where they've got a bit of dead stuff in the bottom might be good for you, or even some of these breads that have dead microbes in them. So this could be a whole new era in the food industry. And myself and current other microbiome specialists are really excited by this area because it's going to make it really fast track to get some of these products that might, medicinally, you'd be worried about what's that microbe doing because
of course
it's not normally in food, but if it's dead,
right.
It's going to be much easier to play with. So this could be a whole new explosion of medicinal foods.
Right. No, it's extremely exciting. That's why I mentioned it. There's one called urolithin A. Have you heard of urolithin A, which increases mitochondrial health, and more mitochondria increases mitochondrial turnover? There's no drug I know that does that. And so to see us using, I always talk about our microbiome as this $100 billion pharmaceutical factory that we're all born with in our guts. And there's so many effects that we just don't even know yet. And it's such a good idea to...
Yeah, the microbes that reduce your cholesterol.
Yeah.
That these bile acids, salts, so they can produce these. And so, do the job of our liver, and so, I think, and the fact, really, it's hard to see many downsides of having particularly the dead forms of these microbes, because they will get flushed out of your system. We'd be able to monitor them really very easily. They're not going to take over, which is the danger of...
They don't replicate.
Yeah. This is the danger of, we're finding these interesting microbes that might be anti-inflammatory in our guts. But if you started putting them in foods and other things and going to people where they weren't normally there, you don't know how the rest of their community would deal with it.
Exactly.
So I think it's super exciting to, just another phase in the wonderful world of the gut microbiome. But it just means, we all need to be experts in this.
Absolutely. I think another exciting area of research right now too is fecal transplants as well. You see a lot of pre-publication data around fecal transplants being useful in certain disease states, in fact, completely reversing certain disease states. And I was wondering to get your opinion on fecal microbiome transplant.
I was really excited about 10 years ago
in
fecal. I wrote an editorial on it. And this was a time they were just starting a lot of the clinical trials. It turns out that most of them have failed. And the particularly ones that have failed, it's failed to show any benefits for obesity. It works in mice, but not in humans. So, so a lot of these worked really well in mice, but you can never totally trust mice studies because the experimenters can just, lose a few hundred mice in, failed experiments and they never report it. You never quite know what's going on. And the effect sizes might be completely different in humans. So I think that's what was the case here. So it didn't work in diabetes, didn't work in obesity. And the only cases it has worked in ulcerative colitis and recurrent C. diff.
Yes, C. diff, we used it.
So it is now the number one treatment for recurrent C. diff. It has 90% success rate. So it is established medicine, if you like.
Right. No, we use it in the ICU when people get C.
diff. And the only other treatment at the time was like gentamicin antibiotics, which had a 25% success rate and equal chance of making much worse.
Right.
The studies, I think it's about 1 in 5 patients with ulcerative colitis will get major improvements that could be permanent.
1 in 5?
Yeah, which is not dissimilar to, some of the immune drugs.
Right.
But it hasn't worked in other conditions. And that's a bit disappointing. There's some evidence in children with some spectrum, autism spectrum
that's where
disorders.
I'm hearing a lot about it, autism spectrum.
it's all very anecdotal.
Yeah, it is.
And I'm not convinced yet that it's absolutely true.
Right.
So, so I don't think it's going to be the answer. The last 10 years haven't done it. So I'm going to put my faith in food rather than so don't offer me a poo transplant at the moment.
So one of the topics that I always love talking about with food is how important it is to regain your relationship with food. And part of that is knowing your food. What are you eating? What are the benefits of it? Focusing on real food. And then also bringing the food home and cooking it and making and preparing your own food. And, you have this book coming out, your cookbook. And I would love to talk about what this cookbook can bring to someone's life and how is it different than other cookbooks, perhaps?
Yes. So the Food for Life cookbook came about because I've written books on the theory,
right,
and getting into the gut microbiome, but people saying to me, "Oh, it's all right. Yeah, I've read your books. I get it, but what do I eat day to day?" I said, "Well, just follow the theory, And they said, "No, I want more." So I realized that people did want some practical examples of what I thought was eating for your gut, really good food that is also tasty. So that's where this idea of the cookbook with 100 recipes came out that is plant-based and follows basically these 6 key principles that we've got, which is eating a third, trying to get as many plants in a week as you can. So every recipe is maximizing plants. You're eating the rainbow, so they're all colorful dishes, which means you're getting defense chemicals and all the other good nutrients. You've got plenty of fermented foods, so finding opportunities to add fermented foods into these recipes. So most books don't tell you how to add in kefir to a recipe instead of cream. They don't say how can you introduce sauerkraut into a salad, how to make a kimchi salad dressing, or all these mixing things which we had to come up with of how do you get more fermented foods into your regular diet without just going hardcore.
How do you get? I struggle with that too.
And how do you get kids to like it?
Right. How do you get kids?
Right. So these are ways of just blending it into the food so they'll find it super tasty.
Yeah.
Then there's a thing about protein pivoting because there's no meat in here. The average American's going to be worried about their protein because they've been indoctrinated about protein. So I said, well, do you realize how much is in beans? You can swap lots of things. A white sauce that you make with flour, you make that with beans. There's a bechamel. You can just many recipes with swapping, like a lasagna recipe is made with a bean layer to really pump up the protein.
Yeah.
Then you've got this other concept. None of the recipes have a calorie count in them. And it's moving people into quality, not calories. And there's nothing ultra processed. Even stock cubes we've switched out here.
Oh, okay.
Because they're ultra processed. So giving people a way to make your own stock cubes, or use miso paste, which is a very natural fermented alternative to which I'm now addicted to. And then finally telling people, don't snack, have these sort of big meals that fill you up, and then leave a gap so that you're trained to do it this way. And also don't get obsessed about having to eat breakfast, So a lot of these are meals that can be at any flexible time. And I think we should learn from other countries that, you go around the world, they don't have the same breakfasts, and they can be having their, savory dishes at 11 o'clock in the morning or whatever. So it's about that flexibility. So hopefully people will see this as a new way of thinking about food. And it doesn't, just because it's healthy doesn't mean it's not also, delicious and good for your gut microbes. So all the recipes have a plant count in them, as well as a fiber count. And to my mind, they're the two things, the main two things you look at, and they're all dead simple to make. I mean, that's the other thing. So I can make them all. So,
I
I'm a doctor, not a chef. So, that's why. But I love doing it. It was great fun, actually.
That's a lot of fun. I can't wait to
It's the
try some
practical
of the
aspect of all
recipes.
that science. So
yes.
that's really fun.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that plant count, fiber count, but no calorie count. I try to get all my patients to focus away from calorie counting. I feel like there's a lot of, we talked about earlier, tricks involved in calorie counting. And also, if you eat real whole foods, you won't need the calories. You're going to be full. You're not going to overeat. And so
there's plenty of things. And there's also treats, there's desserts in there. It's not like there's no dessert. Good. So we've got a chocolate mousse, right? That scores really well. It gives a really good Zoe score because we use olive oil.
Yeah.
And we use chickpea to bind it all together rather than eggs. So, you're getting protein, you're getting fiber. It's all these little tricks and things that you can still delicious. Get, really comfort food that's still healthy.
Okay, great. Well, next time you're in town, we're going to have the chef come and cook a few things out of your book, and we'll share a meal together. How does that sound?
That sounds delicious.
I love it. Or maybe I'll give it a try. I'll try cooking it myself.
Yeah, you should try first.
I love it. Well, this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Spector. This was a true treat to have you on. And I've been a huge fan for a long time, and it's great to be able to talk to you in person. And I would just love to let the audience know where they can hear more about you. Obviously, they can find your book. It's called the Food for Life Cookbook, and that's being sold, I assume, in bookstores and Amazon and everywhere else you can buy books. And where else?
So check out my own Instagram, obviously Tim Spector, the Zoe Instagram, ZOE, or the Zoe website, zoe.com. And we also have a Zoe Health Science and Nutrition podcast, very specifically around nutrition. If people are interested to go into depth in some of these subjects, that's a free podcast. And any of I've also got lots of previous books which are more scientific than this one. If people want to go into it about the microbiome, etc. But there are plenty of ways to find me.
Thank you. And a very important podcast. I think the microbiome needs to be highlighted, and I'm really glad to have had this conversation with you. And I can't wait to have you back on again, Dr. Spector. Thank you so much for joining me.
Look forward to it.